All right, so we're going to flip ahead, I guess, to 1 Samuel chapter 1. And so if you've been with us this year, or if you've been following along, you know where we're at. I went through Judges. That was probably last year now. I don't know when we did Judges. Was it January? That's right, you did, that's right. So we finished up Judges, that's right, earlier this year. And then we just finished Ruth, because I felt like I didn't want to skip Ruth coming into 1 Samuel. But 1 Samuel is, if you didn't know, 1 Samuel is probably my favorite book of the Bible. I love 1 Samuel for a few things. Number one, we just finished the book of Judges. And if you don't know, okay, and this is actually a common trap I find a lot of people fall in. Right? They'll say, it's in the Bible, therefore the Bible is saying it's okay. The thing that I love about the Bible is that the Bible doesn't hide the shameful past of things that have happened. It says, yeah, these are the things that happen, and it's not okay. It's not okay to do these things. And of course, the book of Judges is just packed full of that. Where it starts off, it seems like they still want to worship God. God's still with them. And then as you go further and further into the book, you get to the point where, and then men did what was right in their own eyes. They had forgotten God. They had forgotten God's ways. And so here we are at the end of that time period, right after Ruth, right at the time where it seems darkest, where the world seems lost. God is nowhere to be seen. No one's worshiping God anymore. Things are getting bad. I hear the same claim sometimes from people today. They'll say, we've forgotten God. Things are getting bad. It's getting dark. It's getting horrible. And that's why I love the book of 1 Samuel. Because if you don't know, the book of 1 Samuel is where we begin to see the hope of the world once again be brought back into the world. Where things get darkest, suddenly God brings light. It is incredible. And it all starts here with the birth of Samuel at the beginning of 1 Samuel chapter 1. So it says this: there was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zophite, from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. And he had two wives, one who was called Hannah, and the other who was called Peninnah. And I thought that was funny, but Lenina's not here. But anyway, Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Now this, I made that comment earlier, by the way, about sometimes people will say, well, the Bible has it in it, therefore it is saying it's okay. One of the things I want to point out here is he had two wives. Now, why do I say that? Because does it say, and God said this was good? Right? We have the Genesis story where it said, this is how God made things, and he said it was good. Right? It was very clear. I want to make this point because this is one of the points that often gets brought up by people that are trying to be in support of polygamy. They'll say, well, see, the Bible had polygamy. It's like, yeah, and God never seemed okay with this. In fact, he keeps calling them out on this behavior over and over and over again. In fact, it's almost like he designed things one way, but he makes room for sinners nonetheless. Right? Even God was a God of grace even then. Year after year, this man, this Elkanah, he went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh. Okay, this is one of the rare few exceptions of people that are still following God. Where Hophni and Phinehas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. And whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This is another great reason why you should not have multiple spouses. It's going to cause fighting. This is a terrible idea. And of course, this went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her until she wept and would not eat. And her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Now, there's a lot of us who have either been in this situation or know people have been in this situation where you're trying to have children, and it's just not happening. It is difficult. It's challenging, right? It's something when I look at this story, I can go, yeah, I can understand the pain that poor Hannah has here, right, in her life, because I'm not sure if it's ever been made clear, but we didn't want to have just one daughter, but that is what the Lord provided, and we're trusting the Lord. But trusting the Lord, having faith in God, can be difficult when we don't understand the why. So poor Hannah, she's committed her life to God, right? She's showing up, she's worshiping, she's praying to God, but in that and also having this terrible sister wife who's just provoking her and egging her on and making her weep and break down and cry. Right, making her feel terrible about the fact that she does not have any children of her own. I can get that pain. Verse 9, once when they had finished eating and drinking at Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Because if you don't know, by the way, whenever they would go to these feasts and stuff like that, it was quite a joyous and merry atmosphere, right? It was more than just a sacred, solemn event. It was actually kind of like a party. It was a good time, and you came and you celebrated, and it was joyous and it was fun, and so there was feasting and eating and drinking, and so things were quite good. And it says, so they had finished eating and drinking. Hannah stood up, and it says, now Eli the priest, he was the high priest at that time, was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. If you remember, there's still no temple. They're still in the tabernacle, right? The temple has not yet been built. And in her deep anguish, right, she's just torn up. Peninnah's being a real jerk to her. She's just feeling terrible, and she prays to God, weeping bitterly. Have any of you ever been in this situation? Your heart is just broken, and you're crying out to God through the tears. God, help me. Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all of his days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. This is a callback, of course. We have a few callbacks going on here. We've seen the image of what was going on with Jacob and Rachel. We see this, of course, going on again with Samson and the vow that his mother gave as well. Right? We're seeing all these holy symbols that are constantly being brought up here. And I don't think that's by mistake. And as she kept praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Right? And many of us can understand the way that she's praying, right? She's sitting there, she's praying, she's saying the words in her head. Her lips are moving. Any of you ever done this? Okay, because some of you are looking at me like I'm crazy, but I know you know what I'm talking about. Right? We've all done it. We've been in these situations where it almost comes out even as a whisper, almost just like a lip smack, but we know the words we're saying. We're saying them to the Lord. But of course, again, this is a joyous, happy atmosphere. There's been drinking and eating, and it's a bit of a party atmosphere. Not raucous, but it's a joyous, happy, merry occasion. And of course, wine and beer is flowing. And so Eli thought she was drunk, and he says to her, how long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine, right? Because at least he still recognized the Lord called us not to be drunkards. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. If you remember, she wasn't even eating anything. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Right? She had an option here, by the way, and I think it's interesting. She could have been really offended that someone just thought, oh, wow, she's drunk. She could have been really offended, but she wasn't. Instead, she just said, no, I'm going to bring clarity to a situation. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. So then Eli, the high priest, answers, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. Right? He doesn't know. He doesn't know what's going on other than this woman seems to be so committed in prayer, having not eaten or drunk anything, and yet seems to be, she's really engulfed in this to the point where he thought something else. So he's like, well, this seems to be genuine. Go in peace. May the Lord God give you what you ask of him. So she said, may your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Then early the next day they arose. So this is obviously near the end of the feast time. So they arose and they worshiped before the Lord, and then they went back to their home in Ramah. And Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. And so in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel. Samuel, of course, in Hebrew sounds like heard by God. So that's why it says in saying, because I asked the Lord for him, she was heard by God. And so then when her husband Elkanah went up, if you remember the Passover, he seems to be going up once a year. And so likely if you're going to be making the pilgrimage, it's going to be Passover. Passover, if there's one feast of the year, you're going to make the pilgrimage up to the temple or up to the tabernacle, it's going to be Passover. Passover is the big feast of the year. So it's likely that's what it was. And it says her husband Elkanah went up with all of his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord. So it seems like he's going back up to the tabernacle for Passover to fulfill his vow. But this year, right, if you remember, Samuel is just born, so he's maybe, 3, 2, 1 month, fresh newborn, who knows, but he's very, very, very young. It says Hannah did not go with them. Instead, she says to her husband, after the boy is weaned, then I will take him and present him before the Lord, now, and he will live there always. Right? She recognizes what that this son, that Samuel was a gift from God, that Samuel was this extraordinary provision from God. That God opened her womb to allow her to have a son. And in recognizing this, she decides that not only is Samuel going to live for the Lord always, but he's going to live for the Lord at the temple. Do what seems best to you, her husband Elkanah told her. Stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word. And so the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. And then after he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull. Now, depending on your Bible might say something different. Some say 3-year-old, some say three bulls. The point is that this was a good sacrifice, an ephah of flour and a skin of wine, and she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And when the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, to Eli, pardon me, my Lord, as surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you, praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord for his whole life. He will be given over to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. That's chapter 1. Now the question is, okay, so what are we supposed to get from that? She prayed, she got what she wanted, and then she gave it away. But I think it's so much more than that. Here we have a woman of faith in a dark time. As I wanted to make sure that was clear. I wanted us to remember, this is not a good and holy time. This is not a time where it is popular to worship Yahweh. This is not a time where it is popular to be going up to the temple. Remember, the popular things at this time are Baal worship, Moloch worship, that in most cases, most of the people that she would know, when they're offering their children up to God, they're offering their children up to a bronze idol to be burnt alive. There's a lot of things happening in this where we recognize, again, just like how Abraham brought Isaac before the Lord. Here she brings Samuel before the Lord. She's recognizing the significance of the provision that God has given her. She recognizes, right, because there was no stipulation, there was nothing said before that he was going to have to go and live at the temple, only that he was going to live for the Lord. But she was willing to recognize just how much God had done for her. She was willing to listen and obey and follow that duty, that follow the will of God, even when it became most difficult. Could you imagine how many years she must have gone year after year after year to the temple, having that terrible woman pester her till she broke down and cried and wept bitterly every single year? To not have any children of her own. Suddenly, a miracle upon miracles, a child is born. And what does she do? How many of us would have the strength to let go? This is a tremendous act of faith. This is a tremendous act of trust. Right? I think that's an important thing for us to understand, is that faith and trust, they're synonyms. We often use the word faith, and it is, of course, appropriate to use in a setting regarding God, but the fact of the matter is that faith means that we trust God. And what did she do? She trusted God with her only son. That he would be brought up, live in his ways, in a time where everyone else is following every lust of the flesh, going after their own heart's desires. Once again, we see someone doing the difficult thing, making a difficult choice. We read about Ruth the last time I was here. The difficult choices she made, the sacrifices she made for her future, right? She didn't foresee a future where she was going to meet this man and end up having children of her own. She just thought, well, I'm going to go off and I'm going to stay with Naomi and I'm going to take care of her, because she had that sense of duty, that she wanted to do the right thing. And here we have Hannah this week. Once again, we see that Hannah is being remembered, being recognized. Why? Because she knew what she had to do, and she was willing to follow that and trust God, even in one of the most difficult circumstances I could ever imagine. I can't imagine being in the same situation. Right? Does she never see Samuel again? Of course she would have seen Samuel again, right? Every time she came to the temple, every time she would have come and visited, she would have been able to see her son. But she would have missed out on so many precious moments. But she trusted the Lord. She trusted that if God was going to provide this miracle, then God must have a plan for this child. And I don't know if you know, but we got 2 books of Samuel. He was a pretty important guy. And it all started because of the faithfulness of someone who is willing to give everything. Sometimes, and you know what? We don't even know if she got to live long enough to see her boy become the man who ended up paving the way for the greatest king that ever lived. We have no idea. What we do know is that she trusted God, and that each and every one of us is going to be at some point in our life called to do the same thing. And guess what? We may not see the fruit of that sacrifice. We may not see what that is going to become. Sometimes God just asks us to do things, and if we're going to trust Him, if we're going to follow Him, if we're going to believe that He has the very best for us in mind, then that means going out on a limb. And I want to point this out as well, just before we close up here. It's not a blind trust. How many of you have heard that? Well, Christianity, it's just a blind faith. You just got to blindly believe that there's a God out there. It's not a blind faith. Have any of you ever heard that before, though? Never heard someone call it a blind faith? Interesting. Atheists say it all the time, by the way. But here's the thing, it's not blind. We have miracle after miracle after miracle. See, this woman, Hannah, she would have remembered very, very clearly the stories being recalled of them being saved from Egypt, of the stories as they went into the wilderness and God provided water from rock and manna from heaven. They would have remembered the time where Joshua led an army and God held the sun in place. They would have remembered when they arrived at the walls of Jericho and called out and the Lord brought down the walls and the Lord took that city that day. They would have remembered that as they marched into the land, that God provided every victory and paved the way, that no matter how many kings came upon them, they came and they got victory one time after another. Why? Because the Lord was with them and miracles were happening. We don't have to believe blindly. God is still doing these things today. But you got to look for it. If you don't look for it, you're not going to find it. I like pointing this out I remember when Rebecca and I were on a honeymoon, and we were there for probably 3-4 days, and then I finally noticed this little lizard. I went, oh, that's interesting. I've never saw this before. And of course, once I was aware that it was there, suddenly I started seeing them everywhere. I was like, holy smokes, these lizards are everywhere. What's going on? That's what happens when we start to pay attention to the miracles of God. And you start to pay attention, and you're looking for his fingerworks or his fingerprints, and you're looking for the things that he's doing around the world. Suddenly, you start to realize, wait a minute, look at all these things that God is doing. Look at all the provision that God is making. Look at all this wonderful stuff that God is doing. We're not going into this blind. We're not going into this not knowing what's going to happen. God is alive and active today. He's doing things, and if you need that reinforcement for your faith, all that needs to happen is you need to open your eyes and take a look around you and see all the wonderful things that God is doing. It's not by accident. It's a plan. Just like he had this plan for Samuel. But it also means we have to trust. We need to put our faith in the right place. Because guess what? We don't read about Hannah unless Hannah puts her faith in God, right? We would have read about someone else. I've often heard, that was always a question that got brought up when we were in Bible college. Well, why did God pick Abraham? Because Abraham listened. It's that simple. In a time where no one's listening, Abraham listened. In a time where everyone walked away from God, Hannah obeyed. Ruth obeyed. And as a result, they got brought into the greater plan that God has to offer. And if you want to be a part of that, you can be. But it means you got to put your faith, your trust in the Lord. Be willing to follow him. And recognize that maybe you won't see the fruit of it. But I trust that God is going to use it for his good.